Hello and welcome to We Live in a Society. This is part 2 of life under hotel quarantine at the Hilton in Sydney, Australia. So back in August 2020, I had to return to Australia from France after receiving news that my mum was ill. So I live in France. I've lived in France for a little under 3 years now. I have a permanent job here in France. So back in March, when the government was recalling its citizens from their travels abroad or their less permanent part-time job positions overseas to come home, it was much safer for me to actually remain in France. I lived here under the very strict lockdown laws of the city that I was in, and I did my best to telework for the 2 months that France was completely shut down. And it was also in Australia's best interest for me not to return, because at that point, Italy and France were kind of the hotspots in Europe, and so it was better for me to stay put under home quarantine for those 2 months than to try and return to Australia, where I wouldn't have had a job, and it was much safer for me just to stay here. But then it became apparent that I needed to go home in August. Okay, so part 1 of this video series talked about everyday life for those 14 days under hotel quarantine, from the monotony of it to the security, the testing, the restrictions, and also our risk of exposure to COVID from other guests due to, I think, mismanagement or poor management of the whole hotel quarantine process. And so I've had quite a few people ask me how I managed to get flights back when lots of citizens are stuck abroad. And so basically, because of the emergency situation, I booked the flights less than 24 hours before we actually flew from Paris back to Sydney. And so we booked the flights through ANA and Lufthansa websites directly. We didn't use a third-party booking system or travel agents or anything like that. And we opted for flights. The flights we took were like 80 hours worth of flights. So we figured if we booked them, they had very, very long stopovers. There were 17 hours both in Frankfurt and in Japan at the Haneda airport there. And so we booked flights that we thought were unlikely to be cancelled or delayed because they were so unpopular, and we wouldn't be bumped off those flights due to passenger cap numbers or anything, like to the limited passengers and the passenger caps that were happening. And so we just hoped by taking that route, that longer, less popular route, that we would somehow make it back. And we're just hoping that our flights, because there was a passenger cap at that point, 350 people only were allowed to return to Australia daily. So we're just hoping that we somehow managed to get back into Australia. But there's nothing we could really do about the passenger cap if our flights were delayed or cancelled because of that. But we did opt for flights that were less popular in the hope that there wasn't limits on the amount of people on each flight that would then maybe delay us boarding those flights and getting home. And so we also chose transit hubs that we thought were unlikely to close their borders within that time frame of us flying home. And so we avoided the Middle East, because usually on the way back to Australia from France, you go through Abu Dhabi, Dubai, or Doha. And so we tried to avoid that. We also didn't want to get stuck in the Middle East in the event that borders started to close. We also avoided London, which was lucky, because the day after we left, London actually closed its borders to people arriving from France. And so we would have had to do a 2-week quarantine there before then making our way to Japan and then on to Australia. So we were really lucky that we got out when we did. And so we also we just took carry-on luggage. We didn't take any checked-in baggage, just to make it easier. And it was also lucky that we did that, because we were told in Japan that they wouldn't have been able to check our luggage all the way to Sydney. We would have had to collect our baggage in Japan and recheck it in, and we weren't allowed to do that because we couldn't leave the airport. We were only allowed to stay in the transit areas, so we wouldn't have been able to get our luggage. And so in this video, I'm going to talk more about our arrival into Australia and some of the things that I didn't talk about that I forgot to talk about that occurred during hotel quarantine, and also just a few of the little differences when I first got out, the differences between life in Australia and France. I'll also do part 3 where I talk about the differences in response between France and Australia to the pandemic, but I won't go into too much detail in this video. So when we first arrived into Australia, we were met by border security and healthcare workers that took us aside and assessed every individual regarding whether or not they were potentially infected by COVID-19. And so when we were deemed fit to enter Australian soil, we were escorted by the military to buses, and then taken to an undisclosed location by a police escort. So it was kind of more like, rather than returning home, it was kind of like more you were entering Area 51. It was just, you had that ominous feeling about it. So yeah, once we arrived at the hotel, we were then one by one taken off the buses, registered, and then placed in our hotel room by the military without a key, and we were told to remain there for 14 days or until we either tested positive and taken to another quarantine facility, or we had 2 negative COVID tests and we were released into society. One of the major problems that we experienced during our hotel quarantine was the lack of airflow. So our room, we were at a 5-star hotel, but our room didn't have a balcony. We weren't allowed to go outside, and we couldn't open the windows. And so the air conditioning, you could turn it off, but you couldn't adjust the setting. And so it was set to freezing cold. It was too cold. So we turned it off. But then after a couple of days, we noticed, we woke up one morning and like the windows are completely fogged over. The walls are dripping from condensation. The whole, like the room was just damp, and after a couple of days, this just started to really affect our breathing. We had breathing difficulties, and everything was just wet. So you couldn't live like that. So we had to turn on the air conditioning. But obviously then the room was so cold. Now, because we didn't take checked in luggage and we only had our carry-on, I didn't have any jumpers. I only had like a leather jacket. So I was absolutely freezing the entire time. Luckily, we were provided with robes. So I'm just pretty much for the whole 14 days wrapped in my robe, trying to stay warm. So that was a problem. And as a result of that, our towels they just wouldn't dry. Now, because there's obviously no room service, no one's going to be coming and making our bed and giving us fresh linen and towels on a daily basis. But I mean, the hotel was great. After the 7 days, they then provided us with towels and sheets that we would then, we could change the bed ourselves and then put them into like a biohazard bag and place them outside of the room by the door. So we could, but change so they gave us the option to be able to change our bedding and get fresh towels after day 7. But after day 3 or 4, these towels, after not being dry for like 3 or 4 days, they, it wasn't particularly pleasant. And so that became a real problem. And we only had a couple of sets of clothing. So we were trying to wash our clothes in the bath because they did provide us with washing detergent. And there was a clothesline over the bath. So we, were hanging up our clothes, but nothing would dry because everything was damp from having the air conditioner turned off. So, I'm sitting there ironing my underwear, trying to bloody dry them. It was ridiculous. So we had to turn the air conditioner back on, but then we were freezing. And so another thing also, I'm pretty sure the room was bugged because there was one particular day. So I'll just start a bit of background information. So when you put in hotel quarantine, you can opt to have a mental health nurse call you every day. So I opted for that. Because I just thought, it might be good to have someone to touch base with every day, considering that, I thought I might need someone to talk to, being stuck in hotel quarantine, I just wanted to get home to my family, and I thought it might be good just to have that outlet. So I opted for the mental health nurse, and also a doctor would call you every day and rattle off about 10 different symptoms and whether or not you were presenting with them on that particular morning. So they would call. Usually we got the phone calls, one at 8:30, another at 9 o'clock in the morning, every day, consistently without fail. And so we'd already had our phone calls. And there was one day, and I was upset, about my mum, just about what she was going through and the doctors and the treatment plan. So I was worried about that, and I guess I was talking quite loudly and just upset. And then I get a phone call from somebody checking on my welfare. I'm like, that's a bit strange because I already had my phone call for the day. And so I thought that was a little strange. And the security guard who's posted outside our door, he was posted directly in the center of the hallway. So we were towards the far end. So he was a couple of doors down. There's no way he could have heard me and radioed someone to do a welfare check. So the next day, I'm like, So I'm like, let's pretend to have a fight and see if I get a call. So we'd already got our 2 calls for the day. And so then we started arguing loud. And then 5 minutes later, the phone rings for a welfare check. So I thought that was really bizarre. I mean, we checked the room for bugs. We couldn't find anything. But I thought that was really, really strange. Okay, so another issue was with the security guards that were guarding us. They were guarding each floor of the hotel for the floors where people were under hotel quarantine. In that he wouldn't wear his mask. Now he's in he's in a hotel set up for quarantined people that were likely exposed to COVID in their travels home. He wouldn't wear a mask. Like we'd open our doors 3 times a day to get our food. And a lot of the time, I'd watch through the peephole as they were going by doing that. And when the doctors, the lady across from us had COVID and she got taken away, so I'd watch. And he'd put his mask back on when he saw the doctors there, or when the military or the police came up onto the floor. But during mealtime and all the other times, we'd go grab it, and he wouldn't be wearing his mask, which I thought was extremely dangerous because also the Fitness First gym next to our hotel actually had 3 or 4 cases of COVID, which then spread through Sydney. So I assume that it was could have been from the security guards on our floor not wearing their mask and then attending the gym, because it just seems a bit of a coincidence otherwise, especially since several people on our floor tested positive and this guy wasn't wearing his mask most of the time. So I thought that was really just stupid. So one other thing that I didn't mention before is that we were under hotel quarantine. We were allowed to place Woolworths orders that were then delivered to the reception, and then reception would bring them up to our room. But because I'd requested a mental health nurse, and because there's been at least one suicide under hotel quarantine due to mental health issues, every delivery was searched by the police, and then they removed things like razor blades or anything that could perhaps be used to end your own life. So so it was a bit difficult after 14 days not having access to a razor. I was quite hairy by the end of the stay. Okay, so after 2 negative COVID tests, we were set to leave hotel quarantine after the 14 days. And so they'd called us up the day before to organise our departure time, and we were set to leave at 10 a.m. However, our departure date also coincided with the Sydney Harbour Bridge crash. So we weren't getting public transport because I didn't want to risk exposing myself to the virus on the way back to Newcastle. So we'd organised for a family member to come pick us up. But because of that, he was delayed getting to us, and he didn't arrive till 10 past. And so we're all our bags packed. He's messaged that I'm downstairs. We go to leave, and we're stopped by security. You can't leave. And why? Why can't we leave? We have our wristband on. We're allowed to leave. We've tested negative twice. Oh no! Someone will call you. You can't leave right now. A couple of hours have passed. Meanwhile, poor Shane's driving around the block, and eventually he had to park and stay there, but he had to keep moving because you can only park for an hour. So 3 hours later, we're still stuck there. No one's letting us leave. No one's letting us know why we can't leave. And I'm starting to get desperate. I want to get home. And so no one would tell us what was happening. And so I'm like, that's it, we're leaving. They can't stop us. So we went to go. Security tried to stop us. We said that we're going. We can't be. You can't hold us here against our will. And that's when the police guy came, and and then he obviously couldn't hold us there. He had to escort us out along with some hotel staff, and we went out a back door. I think what had happened is a couple of other buses had arrived to place people into hotel quarantine, and because each person has to go in one by one and be registered and taken up there, that whole procedure for one bus for my bus when we arrived, there's only about 10 people on that bus. It took 2 hours. So I assume with the 2 buses, 4 hours. I think that was what the hold up was. But nobody told us this. No one said, there's buses arriving at 10. You need to leave before then, because we could have just gone down outside. So that we could have just gone downstairs and waited for Shane there rather than stay in the room. So I think that was really poor management, because it meant we were stuck in Sydney for an extra 4 hours. And meanwhile, poor Shane's, driving around the city, going from parking spot to parking spot, just waiting for us to pick him, for him to be able to pick us up. So I think that was really poor management by the Hilton there. Okay, so finally we were able to leave hotel quarantine. We walk out onto the street, and immediately I just started having a panic attack. So coming from Europe, where the situation's very dire, especially in France, it was just really hard just to reconcile just the attitude of the Australians going about their business. In France now, it's law to wear a mask outdoors or in public places. In Australia, in Sydney at least, maybe 10% of people were wearing a mask. There was no social distancing in place. There were no limits to the amount of people entering stores. I really just was shocked and sort of had a bit of a panic, because when I say it was dire in France, I lived across from a hospital morgue. And so, I get up and make my coffee in the morning and look out the window, and coincided with the bodies being taken out of the hospital from those that had died the day before or overnight. And so at the start of the pandemic, the frequency of that was increased slightly, but not a lot. Towards the, a little while into the pandemic, maybe a month or two, the people removing the bodies started to wear masks and gloves. And yeah, the bodies were still in coffins though, and this would happen in the morning, a higher frequency than on average before the pandemic. But towards the height of the pandemic, bodies were coming out in body bags, no longer even in coffins. And not only did the people removing them have gloves and masks, they were in full body suits. And it was just seeing that every day. And then coming back to Australia where people are complaining about wearing masks, it was just, I couldn't comprehend it. I just sort of started panicking. I'm not sure if it's like that everywhere in Australia, but at least on Pitt and George Street when I first came out, it was like that. And I live in Newcastle, which is about 2 hours further up the coast from Sydney. And it was like that there too. But there aren't many cases in Australia, so, but still, it was just a real shock when I first arrived back.